The morning mist clung to the Maryland countryside like a shroud of uncertainty as General Robert Edward Lee surveyed the rolling hills near Sharpsburg on September 16, 1862. His Army of Northern Virginia, though battle-hardened and fiercely loyal, bore the weathered faces of men who had marched too far on empty stomachs and worn thin boots. Lee's audacious invasion of Union territory represented the Confederacy's boldest gamble yet, a calculated risk that could either secure European recognition and force Lincoln to negotiate peace or doom the Southern cause entirely. Lee's strategic mind had conceived this Maryland campaign with multiple objectives intertwined like the threads of a complex tapestry. By moving the war away from war-torn Virginia, he hoped to give his home state's farmers time to harvest their crops without the constant threat of Union armies trampling their fields. More critically, he believed that a Confederate victory on Union soil might persuade Great Britain and France to formally recognize the Confederate States of America, potentially providing the diplomatic and material support that could tip the scales of war. The Confederate commander understood the delicate political balance that hung in the air like the acrid smoke of countless campfires. European powers watched the American conflict with keen interest, their textile mills hungry for Southern cotton, while their moral sensibilities increasingly turned against the institution of slavery. A decisive Confederate victory in Maryland could present the rebellion as a legitimate struggle for independence rather than a defense of human bondage. As Lee positioned his forces along Antietam Creek, he remained unaware that his carefully laid plans had already begun to unravel through a stroke of extraordinary fortune for the Union cause. Days earlier, 2 Union soldiers had discovered 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper that would prove to be a complete copy of Lee's battle plans, detailing the dispersion of his army across Maryland. This intelligence windfall, known as the Lost Order, had fallen directly into the hands of General George Brinton McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan, despite his reputation for excessive caution and his tendency to overestimate enemy strength, recognized the magnitude of this opportunity. For once, he possessed detailed knowledge of Confederate dispositions and could potentially destroy Lee's divided army piecemeal. The normally hesitant general moved with uncharacteristic speed, pursuing Lee's forces with nearly 87,000 men, almost twice the size of the Confederate army. The stage was set for what would become the bloodiest single day in American military history. Neither Lee nor McClellan could have imagined that their impending clash would provide President Abraham Lincoln with the political capital necessary to transform the war's fundamental purpose. The battle that was about to unfold along the banks of Antietam Creek would not merely determine the fate of Lee's invasion, it would create the moment Lincoln had been waiting for to announce slavery's end and redefine the conflict as a war for human freedom. In Washington, Lincoln sat with a draft proclamation locked away in his desk drawer, waiting for the Union victory that would give moral weight to his words and prevent European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. The pre-dawn darkness of September 17, 1862, carried an ominous weight as soldiers on. Both sides prepared for what their instincts told them would be a day of unprecedented carnage. General McClellan's battle plan, though blessed with detailed intelligence about Confederate positions, reflected his characteristic complexity and reliance on coordinated attacks that demanded precise timing, a commodity often scarce in the chaos of battle. McClellan had organized his assault into 3 primary phases, each designed to capitalize on Lee's dispersed forces. The morning would begin with Major General Joseph Hooker's 1st Corps striking the Confederate left flank near the Dunker Church, followed by a central assault across the stone bridge that would later bear the name Antietam, and conclude with a coordinated attack on the Confederate right. On paper, the plan possessed the elegance of a chess master's gambit, but warfare rarely followed the neat lines drawn on maps. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the Maryland landscape, Hooker's men advanced through the early morning, missed toward the Dunker Church, a simple white building that would soon become synonymous with some of the war's most ferocious fighting. The attack began with promise as Union forces pushed through the Miller cornfield, their battle lines maintaining formation despite the dense stalks of corn that rose above their heads like a golden maze of death. Confederate General Thomas Jonathan, Stonewall Jackson, had positioned his men with the tactical brilliance that had made him Lee's most trusted lieutenant. His soldiers lay concealed along the edges of the cornfield and behind the modest elevation near the church, their rifles loaded and their resolve hardened by months of successful campaigns in Virginia. When the Union assault emerged from the corn, Jackson's men unleashed volleys that turned the peaceful agricultural field into a killing ground of unprecedented horror. The fighting in the cornfield raged with a savagery that shocked even veterans of earlier battles. Men fell in rows like wheat before a scythe, their bodies creating a carpet of blue and gray that marked the ebb and flow of attack and counterattack. The corn stalks, cut down by rifle fire, fell across the wounded and dying, creating a hellish landscape where friend and foe became indistinguishable in the growing smoke and confusion. According to contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the intensity of the fighting in those early morning hours surpassed anything previously witnessed in the war, with entire regiments being decimated in minutes of sustained combat. Union Colonel Ezra Carman later wrote that the cornfield was so full of bodies that it seemed one could walk across it without stepping on the ground. Brigade after brigade fed into the meat grinder of the cornfield, with neither side able to maintain lasting advantage. Union forces would advance, pushing the Confederates back toward the church, only to be struck by fierce counterattacks that sent them reeling back through the corn. The white walls of the Dunker Church, intended as a symbol of peace and spiritual devotion, became the focal point of a struggle that embodied humanity's capacity for both courage and destruction. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield, it became clear that McClellan's carefully orchestrated plan was beginning to dissolve into the kind of desperate, bloody fighting that characterized Civil War battles. The element of surprise had been lost, and Lee's army, though outnumbered, was proving that their fighting spirit remained unbroken despite their recent hard marching and limited supplies. By mid-morning, the focus of the battle had shifted to a peaceful country road that wound its way through the center of the Confederate line like a natural trench. This sunken lane, worn down by years of wagon traffic and erosion, would earn the grim moniker Bloody Lane before the sun reached its zenith on September 17th. General Daniel Harvey Hill had positioned his Confederate division along this natural defensive position, transforming a farmer's road into a fortress that would test the resolve of both armies. The Union's Second Corps, under the command of Major General Edwin Vos Sumner, advanced toward the lane with the confidence of soldiers who had witnessed the morning's fierce but indecisive fighting and believed their superior numbers would ultimately prevail. Sumner, at 65, the oldest corps commander in either army, led his men with the steady determination of a career soldier who understood that wars were won through the accumulation of small victories and the willingness to pay the necessary price in blood. Hill's Confederates had used their time wisely, creating firing positions along the elevated edges of the sunken road that allowed them to deliver devastating volleys into any approaching Union formation. The road itself provided excellent protection from return fire, while the natural slope of the ground forced attacking Union troops to advance uphill under the direct observation of Confederate riflemen. It was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare, yet McClellan's battle plan demanded that this position be taken regardless of cost. The initial Union assault came in the form of Brigadier General William Henry French's division, approximately 2,500 men arranged in traditional linear formations that had proven effective in earlier wars, but were becoming increasingly obsolete in the face of rifled muskets and improved artillery. French's men advanced with parade ground precision, their regimental flags snapping in the morning breeze as they marched, toward what many would later describe as a deliberate march into hell. Hill's defenders waited with the patience of experienced soldiers until the Union lines approached within effective range, then unleashed coordinated volleys that shattered the advancing formations like glass struck by hammers. Men fell by the dozens, their bodies marking the high water mark of each successive assault as French's division was systematically destroyed by Confederate fire. Wave after wave of blue-uniformed soldiers advanced up the gentle slope toward the road, only to be cut down by the methodical fire of defenders who had turned warfare into a grim science of mathematics and murder. The carnage in and around the bloody lane reached proportions that defied contemporary understanding of warfare's human cost. As reported in later issues of the New York Tribune, soldiers described the scene as resembling images from Dante's Inferno more than anything they had previously witnessed in their military service. Bodies piled upon bodies until the road itself became invisible beneath the carpet of dead and dying men, creating a macabre pathway of human remains that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. General Richardson's division followed, French's shattered remnants, adding their own casualties to the growing toll as they attempted to succeed where their predecessors had failed. The sunken road, once a peaceful agricultural feature that had witnessed nothing more violent than the passage of farm wagons and livestock, had become a charnel house that demonstrated warfare's capacity to transform any landscape into a monument to human tragedy. By early afternoon, the accumulated weight of Union assaults had finally begun to tell on Hill's defenders, whose ammunition was running low and whose ranks had been thinned by hours of sustained combat. The bloody lane would eventually fall to Union forces, but not before exacting a price that would echo through American memory for generations to come. While the carnage unfolded in the bloody lane, the third phase of McClellan's battle plan was encountering delays that would ultimately alter the course of American history. Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside, commanding the 9th Corps on the Union left flank, had received orders to assault the stone bridge that spanned Antietam Creek and attack Lee's right flank. This seemingly straightforward objective would prove to be one of the most controversial tactical decisions of the entire war, as Burnside's inexplicable hesitation allowed Lee precious time to reorganize his battered forces. The stone bridge itself was an unremarkable structure, built by local farmers to facilitate the movement of livestock and agricultural products across the creek. 12 feet wide and 125 feet long, it represented the kind of modest infrastructure that connected rural communities throughout antebellum America. On September 17th, however, this humble span became the focal point of a military drama that would influence the fate of millions of enslaved Americans whose freedom hung in the balance of the day's fighting. Burnside's reluctance to advance stemmed from his interpretation of McClellan's orders and his assessment of Confederate defenses on the opposite side of the creek. Confederate Brigadier General Robert Augustus Toombs had positioned fewer than 400 Georgian sharpshooters in well-concealed positions overlooking the bridge, creating a deadly crossfire that could devastate any force attempting to cross the narrow span. From Burnside's perspective, the bridge represented a potential death trap that could destroy his corps in minutes of concentrated fire. What Burnside failed to recognize, or chose to ignore, was that Antietam Creek was fordable at multiple locations, within easy marching distance of his position. The creek, though running higher than usual due to recent rains, could be crossed by determined infantry at several points that would have allowed his corps to outflank Toombs' defenders and assault Lee's right with overwhelming force. Instead, Burnside became fixated on the bridge itself, treating it as the only viable crossing point, despite evidence to the contrary. The delay proved costly in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Each hour that passed, without Burnside's assault, allowed Lee to shift troops from other parts of the battlefield to reinforce threatened positions. More critically, It gave Confederate General Ambrose Powell Hill time to complete his forced march from Harper's Ferry with his light division, a maneuver that would arrive at the most crucial moment of the battle and potentially save Lee's army from complete destruction. Contemporary accounts from officers in Burnside's command reveal growing frustration with their commander's hesitation as the morning stretched into afternoon. Colonel Henry Kingsbury of the 11th Connecticut later wrote that his men could hear the sounds of desperate fighting from other parts of the battlefield and understood that their delay was allowing the Confederates to concentrate their forces against piecemeal Union attacks rather than facing the coordinated assault that McClellan had envisioned. As documented in subsequent War Department records, McClellan sent multiple messages to Burnside throughout the morning, each more urgent than the last, demanding that the Ninth Corps advance across the creek and engage Lee's right flank. Burnside's responses cited concerns about Confederate strength and the difficulty of the crossing, excuses that would later contribute to his removal from command and assignment to less critical theaters of operation. The tactical situation at the Stone Bridge embodied the broader challenges that had plagued Union military leadership throughout the first 18 months of the war. Despite possessing overwhelming advantages in manpower, equipment, and industrial capacity, Federal commanders repeatedly failed to coordinate their operations effectively, allowing smaller Confederate forces to defeat them through superior tactical execution and more aggressive leadership. Burnside's delay at Antietam represented perhaps the most glaring example of this pattern, with consequences that would reverberate through the remainder of the conflict. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Maryland horizon, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia teetered on the edge of complete destruction. Lee's forces had been hammered throughout the day by successive Union assaults that had cost both armies thousands of casualties, yet the numerical disparity between the opposing forces meant that McClellan could afford his losses while Lee could not. The Confederate commander, observing the battlefield from his position near Sharpsburg, understood that his army's survival depended upon either a miracle or the timely arrival of reinforcements that existed only in his hopes and prayers. The miracle appeared in the form of a dust cloud on the horizon, visible to Confederate observers as a brown smudge against the afternoon sky that grew larger with each passing minute. General Ambrose Powell Hill, commanding his light division in a forced march from Harper's Ferry that would become legendary in Civil War annals, was driving his men beyond the normal limits of human endurance to reach the battlefield before Lee's army collapsed entirely. Hill's soldiers, despite having fought and won a significant engagement at Harper's Ferry just days earlier, responded to their commander's urgency with the kind of desperate energy that only comes from understanding that their comrades' lives hung in the balance. Hill himself rode at the head of his column, his distinctive red battle shirt making him easily recognizable to his men as they pushed through the Maryland countryside at a pace that left stragglers scattered along the road for miles behind the main body. The general understood that speed was more critical than unit cohesion. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that he would arrive to find Lee's army in full retreat or complete destruction. His division covered the final miles to Sharpsburg at a pace that military historians would later calculate as among the fastest sustained marches in Civil War history. Meanwhile, Burnside had finally launched his long-delayed assault across the Stone Bridge, though his attack came several hours later than McClellan's battle plan had envisioned. The Ninth Corps' advance, when it finally materialized, struck the Confederate right with the force that might have been decisive earlier in the day. Union soldiers poured across the narrow span in formation after formation, overwhelming Toombs's Georgia defenders through sheer weight of numbers and pushing steadily toward Sharpsburg itself. The town of Sharpsburg, a quiet community of fewer than 1,300 residents that had found itself at the center of American history's bloodiest day, began to fill with the detritus of battle as Confederate forces fell back under Burnside's assault. Wounded soldiers from both armies crowded into houses, barns, and churches that had been transformed into impromptu hospitals where Union and Confederate surgeons worked side by side to save lives without regard to uniform color. The civilian population, caught between opposing armies, experienced the terror and confusion that would become tragically familiar to countless American communities over the next 3 years. Lee watched Burnside's advance with the calm demeanor that had made him legendary among his subordinates, though those closest to him could detect signs of the enormous stress he was enduring as his army faced potential annihilation. The Confederate commander had committed his last reserves to stemming the Union advance, leaving him with no additional forces to meet the crisis developing on his right flank. As documented in post-war memoirs by members of his staff, Lee was heard to mutter that the day might be lost when the sound of artillery fire announced Hill's arrival on the field. Hill's men struck Burnside's advancing forces with the fury of soldiers who understood that they were fighting not just for victory, but for their army's survival. The Light Division, despite their exhausting march and their fatigue from recent fighting, attacked with a ferocity that stunned Union commanders who had believed Confederate resistance was finally crumbling. Blue-uniformed soldiers who had been advancing confidently toward Sharpsburg suddenly found themselves fighting desperately to maintain their positions against fresh troops who seemed to have materialized from nowhere. The arrival of Hill's division marked the turning point that saved Lee's army from complete destruction and preserved the Confederate cause for nearly 3 more years of warfare. As darkness descended upon the Antietam battlefield on the evening of September 17, 1862, an eerie quiet settled over the Maryland countryside that stood in stark contrast to the thunderous cacophony of battle that had raged throughout the daylight hours. The silence was broken only by the moans of wounded soldiers calling for water, the occasional crack of musket fire from nervous sentries, and the grim sounds of stretcher-bearers moving through the darkness to collect the injured and dying from both armies. The human cost of the day's fighting defied contemporary understanding of warfare's destructive potential. Union casualties totaled approximately 12,400 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate losses reached nearly 11,000, a combined total that exceeded the population of most American cities and represented the bloodiest single day in the nation's military history. The statistics, however clinical they might appear in official reports, could not capture the personal tragedies that had unfolded across the farmlands and country roads of western Maryland. Lee spent the evening hours conducting a careful assessment of his army's condition, meeting with his divisional commanders to determine whether the Army of Northern Virginia possessed the strength to continue fighting on September 18th. The reports he received painted a picture of an army that had survived through courage and determination, but lacked the resources for sustained combat against McClellan's numerically superior forces. Many Confederate regiments had been reduced. To company strength, ammunition supplies were critically low, and the Army's transportation capacity had been severely degraded by the loss of horses and wagons to Union artillery fire. Despite these grim realities, Lee's initial inclination was to remain in position and offer battle again the following morning. His aggressive nature rebelled against the idea of retreat, particularly when such a withdrawal would signal the failure of the Confederate invasion of Maryland and eliminate any chance of European recognition for the Southern cause. The general's staff officers, however, presented compelling arguments for withdrawal, pointing out that the Army's survival was more important than any single battle, and that a retreat across the Potomac River would preserve Confederate strength. For future campaigns, McClellan, meanwhile, was declaring victory to his subordinates and preparing reports that would present the Battle of Antietam as a decisive Union triumph. The Federal commander had legitimate reasons for satisfaction with the day's results, as his army had successfully turned back Lee's invasion and inflicted severe casualties on the Confederate forces. However, McClellan's characteristic caution prevented him from recognizing the opportunity that still existed to destroy Lee's army entirely through a coordinated assault on September 18th. Intelligence reports reaching Union headquarters indicated that the Confederate Army remained in position near Sharpsburg, apparently offering continued battle despite the previous day's losses. McClellan's staff officers urged their commander to prepare for a renewed assault, arguing that Lee's forces must be near the breaking point and that one more determined attack could end the rebellion in the Eastern Theater. McClellan, however, chose to interpret the Confederate Army's presence as evidence of hidden strength rather than desperate determination. As recorded in dispatches to the War Department, McClellan estimated Lee's remaining strength at nearly 60,000 men, a figure that exceeded the actual Confederate numbers by more than 50%. This tendency to overestimate enemy strength, which had characterized McClellan's entire command tenure, led him to conclude that his army needed time to reorganize and resupply before attempting another major assault. The decision would prove to be one of the war's great missed opportunities. In Washington, President Lincoln waited anxiously for news from Maryland, understanding that the battle's outcome would determine whether he could proceed with his planned Emancipation Proclamation. The preliminary announcement of slavery's end had been prepared and placed in Lincoln's desk drawer weeks earlier, but the president had wisely decided to wait for a Union military victory that would give moral authority to his words and prevent European powers from interpreting the proclamation as the desperate act of a failing government. The morning of September 18th brought a thick fog that shrouded the Antietam battlefield like nature's attempt to hide the previous day's carnage from the eyes of both armies. As the mist gradually lifted, revealing the awful cost of America's bloodiest day, Union patrols discovered that Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had vanished during the night like ghosts fleeing the scene of some terrible haunting. The Confederate withdrawal across the Potomac River had been executed with the skill that marked Lee's generalship, preserving his battered army for future campaigns while conceding Maryland to Union control. McClellan's pursuit was characteristically cautious, more concerned with consolidating his victory than with destroying the retreating Confederate forces. The Union commander's failure to aggressively pursue Lee would draw criticism from Washington and ultimately contribute to his removal from command, but the immediate political impact of Antietam lay not in what McClellan failed to accomplish, but in what he had achieved. The invasion of Maryland had been turned back. Lee's aura of invincibility had been shattered, and Lincoln finally possessed the military victory he needed to transform the war's fundamental purpose. On September 22nd, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln convened his cabinet in the White House to announce one of the most momentous decisions in American history. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln withdrew from his desk drawer with the solemnity befitting such a historic moment, declared that all slaves in rebellious states would be freed effective January 1st, 1863, unless those states returned to the Union before that date. The president's decision to link emancipation to Union military success demonstrated the political acumen that had carried him from a Kentucky log cabin to the nation's highest office. By waiting for Antietam's outcome, Lincoln ensured that his proclamation would be viewed as a measure of strength rather than desperation, preventing European powers from interpreting the announcement as evidence that the Union cause was failing. The timing also provided moral justification for the unprecedented expansion of federal authority that emancipation represented, framing the proclamation as a necessary war measure rather than a radical departure from constitutional precedent. The international implications of Lincoln's announcement were immediately apparent to diplomatic observers in both Europe and America. Great Britain and France, which had been moving toward recognition of Confederate independence, found themselves confronted with a war that had been explicitly redefined as a struggle between freedom and slavery. European public opinion, already sympathetic to the Union cause due to widespread opposition to human bondage, made Confederate recognition politically impossible for governments that claimed to champion human rights and progressive values. In the Confederate States, Lincoln's proclamation was denounced as an incitement to slave rebellion and evidence of Union desperation, but its practical effects were undeniable. thousands of enslaved Americans began fleeing to Union lines, depriving the Confederacy of essential labor while providing the Federal Army with willing recruits who understood that their personal freedom was now directly linked to Union victory. The war that had begun as a conflict over constitutional interpretation had been transformed into a moral crusade that would admit no compromise or negotiated settlement. The Battle of Antietam thus achieved a significance that transcended its immediate military consequences. While Lee's army had escaped destruction and would continue fighting for nearly 3 more years, the Maryland campaign's failure had provided Lincoln with the political opportunity to redefine American democracy's fundamental principles. The war that had begun with Lincoln's pledge to preserve the Union with or without slavery had become an explicit struggle for human freedom that would either create a new birth of liberty or result in the failure of democratic government itself. As news of the Emancipation Proclamation spread throughout the nation and across the Atlantic Ocean, Americans began to understand that September 17, 1862, had marked more than just the war's bloodiest day. It had become the moment when the United States finally embraced the revolutionary principle that all human beings possess an inherent right to freedom, a principle that would define American identity for generations to come and establish the moral foundation for the country's emergence as a beacon of democracy to the world. The cornfields of Antietam had been watered with American blood, but from that sacrifice would grow the promise of freedom that Lincoln had planted with his proclamation, and that would bloom into the full flowering of American liberty.